We've been looking at some really interesting stuff recently, haven't we? About how people come to understand things differently, and make big changes in their lives.
Yeah, like what leads to those moments when everything shifts for someone? How do we change our minds, really, and why?
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack this one framework that looks at all of that from a really unique perspective.
Yeah, it's an article called Three Encounters in Christian Witness
Three encounters in Christian witness.
by Charles H. Kraft.
Now, I think what makes this so interesting, especially for our listeners who are fascinated by, influence, persuasion, personal transformation, all that, is that Kraft brings this incredible blend of experience to the table.
Right, you've got his background in anthropology and intercultural communication.
Right.
And then you layer on top of that his time as a missionary in Nigeria.
Years of being immersed in different cultures, seeing how people understand the world.
Exactly. So he's not just approaching this from, like, a purely theological
Yeah.
perspective.
No, not at all.
He's really looking at how different cultures experience and understand things.
And what he argues, based on all that experience, is that when it comes to communicating beliefs, and I think you'll see how this connects to the broader stuff we've been discussing, a balanced approach is key.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And he lays out these three fundamental types of encounters: power encounters, allegiance encounters, and truth encounters.
And you hear a lot about power encounters these days.
You do. It's a bit of a buzzword almost.
Right, but Kraft really emphasizes how important it is to understand how all three of these actually work together.
Yeah, the interplay between them is really fascinating.
Absolutely.
And what I found really helpful, I think our listeners will too, is that Kraft's framework gives you this structured way to think about how beliefs and commitments actually change.
Yeah, it's not just theoretical. It's like a roadmap.
Yeah, it's very practical. So whether you're trying to wrap your head around, a big societal shift, make sense of your own personal growth, the changes you've gone through, or even just communicate an idea more effectively, this gives you some real insights.
I think that's a great point. It's applicable to so many different areas.
Totally. And it's not just abstract theory either.
Yeah.
He draws on some really compelling real-world observations, especially the work of anthropologist Alan Tippett in the South Pacific.
Oh, yeah. Tippett's work is foundational to this.
Yeah. And then he uses all these classic biblical stories.
Like Moses confronting Pharaoh.
Right. Or Elijah and the prophets of Baal. It's a real showdown to illustrate these concepts in action.
It's a great way to make these ideas come alive.
So we've got this blend of, academic insight and historical examples. It's a really rich mix.
I think it's going to resonate with our listeners.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so let's dive into this first type, power encounters.
All right, power encounters.
When Kraft talks about these, what exactly does he have in mind? Can you paint a picture for us?
So Kraft's initial understanding of power encounters, heavily influenced by Tippett's work, I gotta say, really focused on these dramatic events, where the power of the Christian God was shown to be greater than the power of local deities.
Like a direct spiritual confrontation.
Yeah, like imagine a showdown, right?
Right?
Tippett witnessed some pretty incredible stuff. A priest or priestess of a traditional religion would, publicly reject their old gods.
Right.
And Kraft gives this powerful example of someone eating a totem animal, like a sacred turtle, which was previously forbidden.
That's a huge statement.
And then they would declare Jesus' protection. And when nothing bad happened, no negative consequences, it had a profound impact, people started to consider the Christian message in a whole new way.
Yeah, that's a striking image, isn't it? Like a real visible challenge to the established spiritual order. It makes you think.
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned, the way we understand power encounters today, it's kind of broadened a bit, hasn't it? It's not always about, these direct deity versus deity contests anymore.
Yeah, for sure. The term now encompasses things like miraculous healings,
Right.
deliverances from what people understand as demonic influences. Really any tangible demonstration that Jesus Christ has authority and power over other spiritual forces or false gods that people might follow or fear.
Yeah.
There's this idea of actively taking ground for God's kingdom through these visible displays of power.
It's a very active, almost militant way of looking at it, isn't it? Taking territory. And Kraft seems to really resonate with Tippett's observation that for a lot of people around the world, especially in cultures where power dynamics are central, these demonstrations of spiritual power are way more impactful than like abstract theological argument.
Yeah, it's like seeing is believing on a very fundamental level,
Yeah, right, right.
And I think that aligns with some of the stuff you've been looking at, right?
It does, actually.
In terms of how beliefs shift, how people come to accept new ideas.
Yeah, Kraft's point, and I think this connects to some of the dynamics we were talking about with like social movements and stuff, is that in a lot of societies where power is really central, tangible evidence is way more persuasive than just intellectual reasoning.
You got to show them, not just tell them.
Exactly.
And Kraft's seen this firsthand
Right.
in his missionary work, so it's not just an academic theory for him.
Right, it comes from experience. And this is a really key point, I think, and this speaks to some of the complexities we were highlighting. Kraft is very careful to say, you can't just rely on power encounters.
Yeah, it's not a magic bullet.
Right. So witnessing a miracle, even experiencing a healing yourself, it's not a guarantee, is it, that someone's going to like totally change their core beliefs or commitments?
Right.
Why is that such an important distinction for him?
Well, because, Kraft explains that in many cultures, people are used to experiencing power from various sources. So while a healing or a deliverance, might be impressive, even amazing to witness, it doesn't automatically mean someone's going to suddenly make this deep personal commitment to Jesus as like the ultimate source of that power.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
It's not a one-to-one thing.
Right. He gives examples of healing campaigns where you saw immediate, visible results, but very few long-term conversions because there wasn't that emphasis on, guiding people into a real relationship with Christ.
Oh, interesting.
So they might accept the immediate benefit,
Right, right.
but not necessarily shift their fundamental allegiance, their loyalty.
So the power is like a catalyst, maybe, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly. It opens the door, but then something else has to happen
Yeah.
for real change to take root.
That's fascinating. Does that resonate at all with any of those, examples of fleeting changes you were looking into?
It actually does. I was reading about this one situation. A community experienced a temporary economic boost
Okay.
due to a specific initiative,
Yeah.
but when the initiative ended, they went right back to their old ways.
Oh, interesting.
It was like that external power, whatever you want to call it, the economic boost.
The intervention.
Yeah, it wasn't enough to create a lasting change in their behavior and their values.
Like the underlying system didn't shift.
Right.
Just the surface appearance.
So that kind of leads us to Kraft's second type of encounter.
Okay.
Allegiance encounters.
Allegiance encounters, yeah.
What are those all about?
So for you and for anyone really trying to grasp this whole process of change, allegiance encounters are key.
Okay.
Because according to Kraft, this is where the real transformation happens.
This is the heart of it. It's about cultivating personal commitment and developing a relationship with Jesus Christ. He says these encounters are the most important because, ultimately a lasting spiritual life is built on individual commitment,
Yeah.
and ongoing obedience to Jesus.
So it's not just a one-time decision. It sounds like he sees it as like an ongoing journey.
Exactly. That initial choice, to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
That's just the beginning.
The starting point.
Kraft emphasizes that it's through these continuing encounters, that involve our choices, our daily choices to follow and obey.
The daily grind.
And God's ongoing guidance that we really grow, in character and we deepen our relationship with God. It's this dynamic, ever-evolving relationship.
So it's not static, it's a process.
Absolutely. It's always in motion.
Okay, so what are some of the, signs or outcomes of these allegiance encounters? If someone's going through this, what does that growth actually look like in a practical sense?
So Kraft talks about developing what are called the fruits of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, the fruits of the Holy Spirit.
Things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness.
The good stuff.
Right. It's about a fundamental reorientation of who we're committed to, shifting away from, values and influences that are seen as contrary to God's ways, and moving towards aligning our lives with God's will. It's a deep shift in our loyalties and our actions. It's not just talk.
It's about walking the walk.
Absolutely. It's putting it into practice. Have you seen similar patterns, in the stuff you've been reading about transformative processes, like shifts in values?
Yeah, definitely. And some of the stories I looked at, there was a clear turning point where people started prioritizing different values.
Okay.
And then their choices, their behaviors started to reflect those new priorities. It was pretty striking.
Makes sense. So you have that initial powerful encounter and then this crucial development of personal allegiance.
Right, the commitment piece. So what about the third piece of the puzzle then? Truth encounters. What role do they play?
So truth encounters are all about understanding.
Right,
Yes.
understanding.
They involve addressing ignorance, like really getting at those misunderstandings, and correcting errors through, teaching and instruction.
Providing accurate information.
Yeah, and it ultimately leads to a more accurate understanding of who Jesus Christ is and what he's done.
So knowledge is power.
In a way, yeah. But Kraft is very careful to point out that, in a biblical context, knowledge isn't just intellectual.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just head knowledge.
No, it's more than that. It's deeply connected to relationship and personal experience.
Oh, I see. So it's about experiencing the truth, not just knowing it.
Exactly. It's not just about, memorizing facts or mastering theological concepts.
It's got to go deeper than that.
Yeah, it has to be lived out.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do these truth encounters then connect back to the power and allegiance encounters we've been talking about?
Well, Kraft argues that truth encounters provide the essential framework, for interpreting both power and allegiance encounters.
Okay, the context.
Right. Without understanding, the source and the reason behind a demonstration of power, its significance can be totally missed.
Yeah, it's just a cool event.
Yeah, or even misinterpreted.
It doesn't have meaning.
For example, imagine someone experiences a healing, right? Understanding that it comes from a loving God who desires their well-being. That gives the event so much more meaning.
It goes beyond the physical.
Exactly. And it can point them towards a decision of allegiance.
Okay, this is something I want to be a part of.
Right. Similarly, understanding the truth about, God's character
Yeah.
and his purpose for humanity, that provides the foundation for making an informed and meaningful commitment to him. It's the why behind the what.
The why behind the what. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how did Jesus, in his ministry, how did he model this three-pronged approach that Kraft's outlining?
So this is where it gets really insightful, I think, for understanding the whole thing.
Okay, lay it on me.
Kraft shows how Jesus' ministry was this beautiful demonstration of all three encounters working together, interwoven.
Yeah, in harmony.
He would often begin by teaching, right? Sharing truths about the kingdom of God.
Setting the stage.
And this was often followed by demonstrations of his power, healings, casting out demons.
The miracles.
Yeah. And then he'd often circle back to teaching, especially with his disciples, helping them make sense of what they had witnessed.
Putting it all into context.
And deepening their understanding of God's truth.
So it's not just a one and done thing. It's this back and forth.
Right. And the invitation to follow him, the call to allegiance, that was a constant thread
It was always there.
throughout his entire ministry.
So it wasn't like a rigid step-by-step program. It was more like a fluid dance between these different elements.
Yeah, precisely. And, Kraft observes that Jesus seemed to employ power demonstrations more often when he was engaging with those who weren't yet his followers.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was a way to get their attention.
He had to kind of break through their existing worldview,
Shake things up a bit.
capture their attention.
Yeah. Hey, look at this.
And with those who had already committed to him, his focus shifted more towards, instructing them in deeper truths.
Okay.
And nurturing their allegiance.
So it's like different approaches for different stages in the journey.
Exactly. You see this, for example, in the calling of the first apostles, significant displays of Jesus's power. And then that's what precedes their decision to follow him.
Okay, I'm in.
Right.
That's a really interesting observation.
And it makes you think about, the leaders and influential figures you've been researching.
Yeah.
How did they initially gain people's attention? And then how did they foster that deeper commitment?
It's definitely something to consider, yeah. Some of the leaders I looked at, they did have these, very public wins early on that seemed to really draw people in. It's like that initial spark. And Kraft also points out that, Jesus was really tuned into the cultural context he was in, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially the, first century Jewish understanding of spiritual power.
Right. It was a big deal back then.
So his initial acts of healing and casting out demons, when he went to new areas.
Yeah.
It was a direct response to that cultural concern.
It was a way to meet people where they were at.
And introduce himself and his message in a way that made sense to them. But like we were talking about earlier, with the limitations of power encounters, Jesus wasn't just performing miracles for show.
Right. Where there was more to it than that.
It wasn't just about spectacle.
He wasn't just trying to impress people.
What were those deeper purposes then? that Kraft identifies.
So Kraft argues that Jesus had, like, at least two crucial goals.
Okay, two goals.
Beyond just, like, proving he could do these amazing things.
It was more than just a magic show.
First, he wanted to reveal the nature of God.
Show people who God really is.
To show his love, his compassion, his care for humanity. Like, he said to Philip, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement.
His acts of healing, deliverance, blessing, those were tangible expressions of God's love in action.
That's like putting love into practice.
Exactly. And second, and this is probably even more important in the long run,
okay,
these acts of power were intended to lead people into that allegiance encounter.
Oh.
To draw them into a personal relationship with God. Experiencing God's power, that can be compelling,
Yeah, it gets your attention.
But Kraft stresses that it's ultimately a conscious decision of allegiance.
Like, I choose this.
To God through Christ.
Uh-huh.
That brings about lasting transformation.
So it's not forced, it's an invitation.
Exactly, it's an invitation to relationship.
That's a really important distinction, I think. So it's like the power breaks down those barriers, those walls people have.
Yeah, it opens them up.
Creates an opening for the truth to be heard and for a relationship to begin.
Right, it paves the way.
Now, Kraft goes into more detail about how these three encounters actually work together, in someone's journey of transformation. Almost like a roadmap. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. He outlines 3 stages.
Okay, 3 stages.
And it's helpful to think of them as, like, interconnected,
Yeah.
often overlapping.
Not always clear-cut.
Stage 1, he calls pre-allegiance.
Pre-allegiance.
This is where you have individuals who are, in his view, under the influence of forces that, like, hinder their understanding.
Okay.
And they're committed to beliefs, outside of Christianity.
They haven't made that decision yet.
Right. In this stage, power encounters are vital.
This is where they come in.
In, like, disrupting those influences,
Yeah, shaking things loose.
Creating space for them to consider new possibilities, opening them up to understanding truth.
Wait a minute, there might be something else here.
Right. And then that's followed by truth encounters, which, provide enough understanding for them to make a decision.
Okay.
And finally, allegiance encounters, which present the challenge, but also the opportunity, to commit to Christ.
Here's the choice. What are you going to do?
Exactly.
So the power creates the possibility, the truth provides the clarity, and the allegiance is the actual decision point.
That's a good summary.
Yeah, I like that.
Huh.
So what happens once someone makes that commitment? Moves into stage 2. The new believer stage.
All right, so stage 2, the process continues, right? It doesn't stop there. Kraft explains that new believers still face, challenges.
Life doesn't become a cakewalk.
No, definitely not.
There's still struggles.
Spiritual opposition. So power encounters remain important. Prayer for protection, healing, guidance.
Okay, so it's not just about those initial big displays of power. It's also about the everyday stuff.
Absolutely. It's about relying on God's power in all areas of life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And alongside that, there's this ongoing need for teaching, right?
Yeah, to keep growing.
For continued truth encounters.
Yeah.
To deepen their understanding of their new faith.
Okay.
And how to live it out practically.
Right, it's not just theory.
And then, really importantly, they continue to be challenged, to grow in their commitment and obedience through allegiance encounters.
So it's like a spiral, almost, going deeper and deeper.
Right. And this ongoing engagement, in all 3 areas, that leads to a stronger relationship with God and with a community of believers.
Yeah, that sense of belonging.
Right, the support system.
Does this resonate with how you've seen, new members kind of integrate into groups or adopt new beliefs?
Yeah. I think it's a pretty common pattern.
You see it in a lot of different contexts.
You have that initial enthusiasm,
Yeah.
And then there's this period of learning, of really getting integrated.
Digging deeper.
Into the new community and its values.
So then, stage 3, ongoing growth. This is where it all kind of comes together, right?
Yeah, stage 3 is where that deepening relationship really starts to have an impact, particularly in terms of sharing their own beliefs with others.
It goes outward.
Right. In stage 3, the growing relationship with God fuels more, potent power encounters.
Okay.
Through prayer. praying for breakthroughs in the lives of others.
So it's not just about your own personal growth anymore.
Right. It's about wanting to see others experience that transformation, too.
I want you to have what I have.
And these power encounters are still accompanied by, truth encounters as believers share their understanding.
Yeah.
And allegiance encounters as they invite those in stage 1 to consider, making that initial commitment.
So it becomes this cycle almost where your own growth feeds back into the process for others.
Exactly. It's dynamic, self-reinforcing.
And Kraft really emphasizes, doesn't he, that all three of these encounters are essential.
Yeah, it does.
Interconnected. Almost like a three-legged stool, If one leg's missing, the whole thing collapses.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Kraft uses this image of like a 3-part circle to show how interdependent they are.
They all rely on each other.
He argues that being freed from hindering influences, which can happen through power encounters, is necessary to truly grasp truth and freely choose commitment.
Okay.
But then understanding and applying truth is crucial for informing our allegiance, knowing who we're committing to and why.
Right. It gives it meaning.
And for understanding how and when to engage in power encounters appropriately.
So it's not just about throwing power around willy-nilly.
No, it has to be guided by understanding and commitment.
And finally, ongoing commitment to God and understanding of his truth are sustained through those continued experiences of God's power,
Yeah.
The power that protects us, empowers us. They all feed into each other.
It's like a beautiful, intricate system.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, so if all three are so critical, why does Kraft feel like something might be missing?
Yeah.
And a lot of people approach their beliefs and share them with others.
So here's where Kraft offers a bit of a critique.
Okay, a different perspective.
And this might be relevant to, some of the things you've been looking at.
Uh-huh.
He suggests that, many traditions have historically emphasized truth and knowledge, sometimes maybe at the expense of adequately engaging with power encounters.
So it's like an imbalance.
Right. And
Yeah.
he believes that in cultures where the reality of spiritual forces is widely accepted, it's just part of their worldview.
Yeah.
This underemphasis on demonstrating God's power can actually be a big obstacle.
People need to see it to believe it.
Yeah. People in these contexts, they're often looking for tangible evidence of spiritual authority, something that resonates with their existing worldview.
It's got to fit into how they already see the world.
Right. It can't just be this abstract concept.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think about all those situations where, like, purely intellectual arguments, no matter how well-reasoned they are,
Yeah.
just don't seem to sway people, if they've got these deeply held beliefs that contradict those arguments.
Especially if those beliefs have, like, a spiritual or experiential dimension to them.
Right. It's more than just head knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And Kraft even talks about there being this kind of opposing force, right?
Yeah, he does.
With its own version of these encounters.
That's right. He proposes that there are forces that, counterfeit truth
Counterfeit truth. Okay.
with misinformation, deception,
Uh-huh.
and encourage allegiance to, like, harmful ideologies or false idols.
So it's like a twisted mirror image almost.
Yeah, it's a distortion.
And he's saying that even those forces can manifest their own forms of power, right?
That's right.
Through deceptive means. So it's like this whole other system that's working against, the Christian message.
And he sees that as a significant challenge that necessitates a full 3-pronged response. You can't just address one aspect and ignore the others.
It's going to be comprehensive.
Right. You need all three working together. And he raises a really interesting point, I think, about how we often try to address problems in different cultures. Instead of tackling what are perceived as fundamentally spiritual issues head on,
Uh-huh.
we often default to offering secular solutions.
Here's a hospital. Here's a school.
Yeah, and while those things are valuable,
Of course.
they don't always address the underlying spiritual needs and beliefs.
Right. It's like treating the symptoms without addressing the root cause.
Yeah, exactly.
So ultimately, what does Kraft believe is the crucial element that might be missing, for more effective and meaningful engagement in the world?
He concludes that the missing piece, the vital component that needs more emphasis, is what he calls genuine New Testament power.
Okay, genuine New Testament power.
And what he means by that is this: the consistent everyday experience of God's presence
Okay.
and his active involvement in the world. Sometimes in ways that might seem miraculous.
So it's not just about the big splashy miracles. It's also about the everyday ways that God works.
Exactly. It's about recognizing God's hand in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary.
So it's like a constant awareness of God's presence and power.
Yeah. And he believes this is essential for effectively countering those deceptive influences we were talking about and for truly making a lasting impact.
It's like the missing ingredient.
Truth and commitment are foundational.
Yeah, absolutely.
But without this demonstrable reality of power, he argues, the transformative potential is often limited.
You need all three working together.
Right.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too. It's always good to revisit these ideas.
Yeah. So just to recap for everyone listening,
Okay.
we've explored these three crucial types of encounters. Power encounters,
Right.
which can break down those existing barriers. Allegiance encounters, which cultivate that deep personal commitment. And truth encounters, which provide the necessary understanding and context.
The why behind everything else.
Exactly. And the real takeaway here, the big aha moment, is that you need a balanced and integrated approach.
Yes.
Using all three
All three together.
for genuine and lasting transformation.
I think that's the key insight.
Yeah. So as you're listening to this, as you're processing all this, think about how these three types of encounters might be playing out in your own life, the world around you.
Yeah, in your everyday experience.
From understanding those shifts in societal values to navigating your own personal growth, the changes you've been through.
To even thinking about how you communicate and try to influence others.
Yeah, how do you get your point across? How do you bring people along with you?
Where do you see these dynamics at work? And which of these encounters might be most emphasized?
Yeah,
Or maybe overlooked?
in your own experiences.
In the information you encounter every day.
Yeah, because we're bombarded with information all the time.
Absolutely. It's a constant stream.
So here's a final thought to ponder.
All right, let's hear it.
In a world that's constantly vying for your attention, your loyalty, saturated with information, competing claims of influence, how might a more holistic approach, one that intentionally addresses understanding,
Okay.
fosters genuine commitment,
Uh-huh.
and acknowledges that human experience of power and its impact,
Yeah.
how might that contribute to more meaningful connection?
Right. Deeper connection.
More impactful transformation?
Yeah, lasting.